Imagine surviving a car accident and facing the unimaginable, between hell and heaven, confronted with your choices and sins. This is the shocking experience that Randall went through after his accident. God showed him the consequences of his life and gave him a chance to repent. Randall chose to return to Earth to share his testimony and God's love. Subscribe to our channel to discover more incredible and inspiring testimonies like Randall's.
All right, today we are jumping into a story that is, well, absolutely remarkable. It's the testimony of a man named Bryan Melvin. Now, back in 1980, he was what you'd call a militant atheist. He was convinced that death was it, the final curtain, just nothingness. But after a completely unexpected and brutal illness, he says he died. And what he experienced next, it didn't just challenge his beliefs, it completely shattered his entire worldview.
Yeah, let's just start with the most staggering part of his claim right out of the gate. This is what Bryan Melvin says he saw during his time in the afterlife. It's a statement that, you have to admit, immediately raises the stakes of his story. It kind of forces you to listen, no matter what you believe. So let's unpack how he got to that point. So the key here is that this whole thing starts with a guy who has zero belief in God, an afterlife, you name it. It's 1980, he's a 20-year-old electrician working out in Arizona, and his life is about to take a turn that he could never, ever have seen coming. The cause was horrifyingly simple. At a construction site, he took a drink of water from a canister that, unfortunately, was contaminated with cholera. And the illness hit him like a freight train. On day 2, he was just violently sick. By the 3rd day, there was this weird, deceptive calm. He actually started to feel a little better. But then he collapsed. He spent a full hour just crawling from his kitchen to his bed, and it was there, in total agony, that he took his very last breath. Okay, this is where things get really bizarre. The second he died, he describes having this classic out-of-body experience. He was literally floating above himself, watching the scene. He could see his dog whining next to the bed, and he noticed how pale and waxy his own corpse looked. But here's the part that makes his story so compelling, the tiny details he saw. He noticed a fingerprint in the plaster on the ceiling and a bandana that was tied around a water cooler up in the attic. When he eventually came back to life, he got a ladder, and sure enough, both things were exactly where he had seen them from above. So after floating through his house, Bryan says he entered a dark tunnel. He felt this incredible sense of love, heard beautiful music, all the things you might expect. But this peaceful journey wasn't leading to some paradise. No, it was leading him to a formal judgment, and from there to a place of absolute, unimaginable terror. You have to imagine, this moment represented the total demolition of his belief system. For 20 years, he was certain that death meant you just stopped existing. But in that instant, he says he felt more intensely alive, more conscious than he had ever been in his entire physical life. His atheism just evaporated on the spot. After seeing his life flash before his eyes, every mistake, every betrayal, every moment of grace he'd just ignored, he found himself standing before a figure he knew was Jesus. And this figure gave him a chilling mission and a really crucial warning. He was told he was about to see a terrible place, and that when it got to be too much, he had to call out the name and the title, Jesus Christ. And just like that, he was yanked into what felt like a scorching hot tornado, hurtling down. The way he describes it is just filled with these horrifying details, the searing heat, piercing screams, a disgusting stench. He finally landed in a valley where these beings that looked like his old friends welcomed him to paradise. But he said their love felt sickening, totally false. When he called them out on it, they transformed into these demonic creatures. And that's when it hit him. He was in hell, and he was there because of the choices he had made. Now, Bryan describes hell not as just some chaotic, fiery pit, but as a very structured place with 6 different levels. And each level had these small cells he called chambers of death. He says the punishments inside weren't random at all. They were tailor-made to fit the sins the person had committed in their life. The deeper the level, the worse the torment. He gives some really specific examples. In one cell, he saw a rich man from ancient times. In life, this guy had pretended to help the poor, but it was all a scam to steal their land. So in hell, he was forced to relive his crimes over and over. But this time, a horde of demons would burst into his cell, beat him, and humiliate him, forcing him to feel the same pain he'd inflicted on others. In another cell, he saw a woman from Paris in the early 1900s. She'd been a prostitute who lived a life of what he called great impurity.
Her punishment was to exist in that state for eternity, her entire being just defined by the same hatred and venom that had filled her heart when she was alive. And this brings us back to that shocking claim from the beginning. In one of the lowest, deepest levels, Bryan says he saw Adolf Hitler. He describes him burning in a cell that looked like an oven, forced to perpetually experience the exact suffering of every single one of his millions of victims, from the gas chambers to every other atrocity. After seeing all of these horrors and being led toward the cell that was meant for him, the whole story just takes this dramatic turn. Just when he felt like all his strength was gone, about to be shoved into his own personal torment, everything changed. This was the moment he went from total despair to an unbelievable rescue. So there he was. He was weak, terrified, about to enter his cell for what he thought was forever. He could barely even whisper the name he was told to use. And then he felt it, a powerful presence walking up from behind him. And with every single step it took, the very ground of hell shook. It was the figure of Jesus. And as he got closer, all the demons just fled in terror. In that moment, Bryan said he had this profound realization that his own actions, his own sins, were part of why this figure had suffered. And yet, despite all of that, he was lifted up, held, and literally carried out of hell. But his experience didn't stop there. Much later, he says he was given a vision of heaven to help him heal. He describes arriving in this beautiful, peaceful field of light he called the Field of Reunion. He saw families joyfully coming back together, all their earthly suffering just melting away. He saw one scene that was particularly moving. A woman who had carried this heavy guilt from an abortion on Earth was met by her child, and the child didn't greet her with blame, but with pure love. And in that one instant, all of her shame and pain was just gone. So after being rescued from hell, returned to his body, and then later getting a glimpse of heaven, how does a person even start to process all of that? Let's look at what happened next, and the incredible transformation that really defined the rest of his life.
Well, that healing wasn't immediate. The vision of heaven didn't happen right away. For 2.5 years after his NDE, Bryan suffered from severe post-traumatic stress because of what he'd seen in hell. It was only after all that time that he was given the vision of heaven, which he says finally brought him some peace and started to heal that trauma. And then, after his vision of heaven, something truly unexplainable is said to have happened. For 3 days straight, his face started to radiate this visible, supernatural light. It was so obvious that strangers would stop him and ask about it. The most incredible moment came when a little kid ran up to him in a store, looked right at him and asked, "Mister, you've seen Jesus, haven't you?" Ultimately, the whole experience didn't just change his mind, it redefined his entire purpose in life. The guy who was once a militant atheist spent the rest of his life sharing his testimony. He went back to school, worked in social services and criminal justice, and eventually went into a full-time ministry just to tell his story to the world. So, what do we make of all this? Was Bryan Melvin's story a vivid hallucination brought on by a terrible illness? Was it a deeply personal spiritual journey that was meant only for him? Or, as he came to believe, was it a universal warning, a revelation about the nature of life, death, and the choices we all make? That really is the question his testimony leaves us with.